Greetings, I'm Sovereign of Elodium, coming to you on Sunday morning here at OG Foundation in Elodium. It's another rainy day video log. I'm going to primarily talk about the birth of a nation, how nations are born, what a nation is, what a state is, what a country is, how it relates to the concepts of contracts and trusts. All about Elodium, how it was founded on October 10th of 2017 and continues to this day. So first off, I'm going to touch on Bitcoin Cash and the war in Russia just really quickly, because that's kind of the theme of these rainy day vlogs thus far. So for Bitcoin Cash, price-wise, last video I was saying it's probably going to consolidate around 250, as the people who have been holding for a long time want to sell at this higher price. And that's why the consolidation kind of phase, I think, is happening now. There's some people who have been holding for a long time, but they're ready to sell at this price. And that will last as long as those people exist. And then when they cease to exist, the price will continue to go up, most likely. I think most likely what is going to be a catalyst for that is going to be the next bank failures, which are surely going to happen as we continue in this higher interest rate environment, where the deposits from the banks are getting drained because they can't provide the return, the interest rate that the Fed is offering, and also the bond interest rates, resulting in a situation where there's guaranteed to be more bank failures. And it's really planned. It's about the consolidation of the banks so that the big ones get bigger and the small ones fail. And so in the next wave of bank failures is likely when you're going to see the next wave of crypto enthusiasm, bullishness, kind of. But who knows when that will happen. So the longer it takes until that happens, it's likely there will be kind of like a consolidation, kind of downward. The consolidation is likely to last until then. So anyways, that's just my hypothesis, and I think that's about all I have to say for Bitcoin Cash. I still haven't started building on the Cash tokens ecosystem, and I likely won't until the end of this build season here because I'm too busy. For the war in Russia, the last video was about Prigozhin, so now he's made amends with Putin or Russia, whether or not it was staged. It still kind of looks staged, and now Russia's pulling their troops out of, that they had stationed in, or they already did, pull their troops out of Belarus to reposition them. They're done with their training, so they've got probably around 500,000 roughly troops in that region that are trained and prepared. If we'll see, it's they can go on the offensive, but it's might be just in the interest of Russia to just not push any further, but just hold what they have. And maybe they think that everything's working in their favor currently, which it seems like what is going on for the U.S. is unsustainable economically, and that they have to escalate to use their big guns in order to prevail. Otherwise, time is against them. So it's a very dangerous situation where it's likely there will be some false flag kind of escalation, which is the worst kind of outcome, but it's just a likelihood given the mentality of the people in power and what they're all about. So that's the end of that little update. So I'm going to talk all about Elodium and the birth of a nation and how it relates to Vermont, how it relates to the United States, the constitutional law. I'm going to try to get to all of that without an outline, without any kind of guidance, and just stream of thought. And really, this is meant for anyone who wants to understand about Elodium. Maybe they want to emulate something similar. Maybe they want to get involved in some way. Anyways, the point being, Elodium is an actual nation, country, sovereign state that has formed out of territory that was previously claimed by the state of Vermont and the United States federal government. So it's in fact the only territory that the United States federal government has laid claim to that has been that they've lost. So the trend of the territory breaking up and being lost has already begun, and it started in 2017, October 10th, when by my right, oh boy, this is going to be difficult to do this whole thing exactly right. I have to say it all factually right without coming from memory, but just coming from a place of fact. So I have to do some degree of groundwork, and there's so much into this. I have to do another preface. So it's not just for people who want to know about allodium. It's largely for the sheriffs and the judges and the lawyers who potentially threaten allodium, because of the fact that allodium is its own sovereign state. It's in its own jurisdiction, and I am a signatory, or I don't really like the word citizen, but I am a resident, a sovereign of allodium. It's a sovereign of allodium, because in order to be a stakeholder in allodium, you have to affirm your sovereignty. So we don't have citizens, we have sovereigns of allodium. There's 7 of us, or 6 of us, 6 or 7 of us, one or the other. So this territory and myself do not fall within the jurisdiction of the state of Vermont or the federal government. Therefore, any attempt to impose that foreign form of overlordship to subjugate me to a trust system which I have not contracted with, it would be seen as a foreign enemy, an invasion, an abridgment of my freedom. And because that's the position, that I will not be subjugated to that judicial system, it is impugnant upon me to proffer the legal status of myself and the sovereign state, country, nation of allodium, to provide the legal proof of it so as to avoid the potential conflict. So there's many different layers. I already know that there's at minimum one Vermont or Addison County Sheriff who is watching this. I guess it could also be for the state police, assuming that it becomes a state issue. So there's the local, the state, the federal. I'm not subject to any of them. There's the potential of interaction with them. And so that's the purpose of this communication, to establish the lawful nature of the jurisdiction of the state that has formed out of my own right as a sovereign, as well as a native-born resident of the country of Vermont, which was formed in 1777 by the authority of the sovereigns of the people. It was never a colony of the crown like the other 13 colonies that then became the first 13 United States. They were all established by the authority of the Crown of England, by their maritime law claims to the waterways of the country, the continent known as America. And Vermont joined that union as the 14th state, but prior to its joining as a state, it was an independent republic for, well, I should know this, it's either 13 or 17 years. 1777, the Constitution was amended in 1786, so that was 9 years later, and then they joined the Union. I don't know the exact date. But the point being that the country of Vermont existed independently of the Union of the former colonies of the British Crown, known as the United States of America. As such, it is of more integral status as to natural law, as to the authority from which it exists. So, by that nature, it's actually more accurate to call the country and continent known as North America as Vermont, the entire continent, which is the country. The country is the land. That's the definition of the country. So do you live out in the country, in the land? Are you a person of the land? The country of a nation is the territory of the nation. The country, if you say define country in Google, it's going to say basically a territory that is inhabited by a nation. But the country is independent of the nation. A nation claims a country, and then that becomes its jurisdiction and the territory of that nation state. So when you have a marriage of a nation and a country, then you can have a nation state. You can have many different forms of states. You can have a city state. There's many different forms of what is a state. Ultimately, it's a state of being, which is constituted. And when it applies to multiple people, it, whether by form of contract, where it's illicitly acceded to, or trust, where it is accepted without outright signatory signing to it. There's many different paths going, and I'm trying my best to stay integral in relation to them all. Itchy nose. That means there's, anyways. So, conflict resolution in order to integrate all these flows. Of that original country of Vermont, the 17th article in the Constitution affirms the right of all people to emigrate from one state to another. So it's talking about all people, every single person, not like a people as a collective, but that all people have a right to emigrate from one state to another that will accept them. So if you want to leave one state and go to another state that's going to accept you, you have an inherent natural right to do so. And similarly, all people have a right to create their own state out of country which they're able to purchase or otherwise obtain. That's how nations, how states are born. The birth of a state is by the will of the people, the person or multiple people who create that state in country, which they either purchase or it's just their domain which they occupy, which they have come to acquire the rights to. So the original Vermont Constitution affirms that right for all people. And if you want a case for this, the existence of Vermont is the case for this natural right of all people, because the country of Vermont refused subjugation to the British Crown. The people of the country refused subjugation to the governor of New Hampshire, the governor of New York, the French in a previous time. So the maritime claim is all relative to the law of the water. So the French up in the St. Lawrence Seaway, Lake Champlain is named after a Frenchman, is a lake which sheds water to the St. Lawrence River, Seaway, whatever, which was the jurisdiction of the French. So originally, the maritime claim of the French, who claimed that waterway, they, by extension, had a claim to the territory that sheds water to Lake Champlain. However, if you look at a map, that puts that territory right, it's like the southernmost part, most indefensible part relative to the East Coast and all the waterways coming up the East Coast, like the Hudson River and the Connecticut River. which it's then in between. And so the British Crown claims the maritime waterways south of the St. Lawrence, and then they divide it into two companies. There's the Virginia Company and the Plymouth Company. So your New England is your Plymouth company, and your kind of Virginia and those southern states is the Virginia Company. So these were the companies that were chartered by the British Crown in order to colonize, conquer, extract the resources of North America. And it's these two companies that end up rebelling against the crown in order to serve the interests of the subjects, the colonists within those crown colonies. This is not the case for Vermont. So Vermont refused that, denied, rejected that government, and formed their own sovereign republic by the authority of the people thereof. And the territory was not formed by the crown. The territory was formed by the people and their willingness to align themselves with the country of Vermont, in contrast, or as opposed to, aligning with the crown colonies of New York or New Hampshire. So this is all a bit of groundwork to understand that to form your own state is a fundamental right. Further, all people in Vermont were free from slavery from its original constitution. As an independent country in 1777, Vermont outlawed slavery. Before all of those crown colonies figured it out, because of course the Virginia Company wanted slavery, and even the Plymouth Company wanted slavery to a certain extent. But ultimately the Northerners wanted it less than the Southerners because they had more urban areas and they had more population, and they could put that population to work and essentially fleece the value that is earned. And a lot of that is literally from sheep and from textiles, but to concentrate that value in the elite class. The slaves were less necessary in the North than in the South in order to do that. But essentially, it's not very different of an ideology or a mind state. It's just different logistics of what is required in order to create that profit. So though Vermont was claimed by these other governments, the territory of Vermont, the claims to the land, the deeds, they were filed in other places. So the parallel with Elodium is that at one point this land here was claimed by the town of Starksboro. And the irony here is not lost, because Starksboro is named after General Stark, who was pivotal in, I don't think he was a general at the time, but in the first major victory in the Revolutionary War. The first victory was Ticonderoga. So that was basically entirely Vermont. There was one guy who showed up and tried to take over from Connecticut, this abdicator essentially, but he doesn't matter. It was entirely Vermont and the Green Mountain Boys, the militia of Vermont, that created the first victory in the Revolutionary War, which was Ticonderoga. Building upon that success and leading from that is the Battle of Bennington. So though Ticonderoga was the first success, and it was basically a flawless victory, and it can't be overstated how important that victory was in order for the United States to exist at all. The storming and capturing of Fort Ticonderoga. And that directly led to the next victory. So retaking Boston being liberated, was entirely a result of Ticonderoga. The victory at the Battle of Bennington was entirely a result of Vermont and the Green Mountain Boys, and result in building upon that victory, but was also dependent upon General Stark, a officer in the Continental Army from New Hampshire, who managed to raise 1,500 roughly militia from New Hampshire and to the aid of the country of Vermont when the British from 3 directions were attacking Vermont from all sides to try to sack the capital and destroy this sovereign nation that defied the authority of the crown and the crown's subjects, and who took their fort from them. And complete embarrassment. History will tell you that this whole battle, or the British strategy, is about dividing the Continental Army into 2. But in fact, what resulted, the Battle of Bennington, the result was not that strategy. The result was basically at least 2 out of the 3 commanders of the British forces who were going to attack on 3 prongs, one coming from Montreal, one going further down the St. Lawrence and coming from the west, from like the Buffalo area, and then another coming up from the Hudson, from the east. So the British got 3 armies. They're not, maybe 2 armies and another force, but they're basically 3 forces, and they're going to all kind of attack the center, and Vermont's basically in the center. But part of this whole theme is that at least 2 out of 3 kind of don't fulfill their orders, and then the other one, the one who was going to come up the Hudson, they decide there's a better victory for them, so they break their orders. Part of this theme that I'm getting to is that America, the whole continent, the land, it's all about the sovereignty of the people. Top-down authority just does not work here. It's rejected by the energy of the people. So even though the crown has some centralized plan, it's like, we're going to divide the continental thing into 3 ways. Like, the people who are in charge of the armies are thinking independently, and they're saying, no, we're not going to do that. So one guy goes and attacks some other city. I think he was Clinton or something. It doesn't follow orders. Of course, Clintons don't. So, well, it's not about not following orders. What they do is they didn't do the teamwork plan. They went and did the plan of how is this commander going to get the most glory for himself, and he's going to go try to capture this other city. So that messed up the whole agenda from the Hudson. Then the one from the west coming from Buffalo, partially due to a guy named Schuyler, they ran into all sorts of problems, so they didn't even get to connect. And then the guys coming down from Lake Champlain, they just get harried and harassed by the Green Mountain Boys the entire way. They can't get any supplies. They lose their or they thought that they were going to get supplies and horses and all this stuff, and then they end up getting down around Bennington, and they're completely battered. So the whole British plan has fallen apart, but they still have a lot of troops, and they basically give up on that plan, and they decide they're going to go raid this capital of Vermont. So Vermont had established itself as a country, and they said, we have a capital here in Bennington, and the capital is the capital of the Commonwealth. Capital, A-L and O-L, different spellings of the same phonetic word. The capital, A-L, is the property, and the capital, O-L, is the territory where that capital is concentrated, which then becomes the nucleus of the state, essentially. So the T-A-L, all the property, was concentrated at the capital, O-L, which was in Bennington, the capital, the original capital of Vermont, or one of these towns right around there. But that's where they had their stash of capital. So the British are going to go and try to steal all the Vermont's goods, the Commonwealth of the people of Vermont, the sovereign independent country of Vermont that was constituted, which includes the right of the people to create their own state in Article 17. In Article 7, it's the right of the people, of the community, to alter and abolish government. So if a community finds that the government isn't in their own interest, it's the right of the community to alter and abolish government. So that's what we did here. So there's actually, in 2017, there's a community of people living here, distinct and separate from the separate community, being an off-grid community, and having a collection of different people and species codependent, and it's a community. So we found that the government that pre-existed was not in our best interest. So we utilized our right to alter or reform government by altering it by abolishing the previous government and reforming it by creating the sovereign state of Allodium, and then staking the territory here, which was my Allodium, created or settled in 2014. So then in 2017, after the property, I had exclusive rights to this territory. It was fenced out, it was posted, and there were no one that was disputing my absolute claim to my Allodium. So then that territory was staked to the new state that was created of Allodium. And Allodium has its own affirmation of truth, rights, and responsibility, which is the ideology, which the least common denominator, which unites all of the sovereigns of Allodium. So everyone who's a stakeholder in Allodium has affirmed this affirmation. It's very similar to the Bill of Rights, and it is what constitutes the ideology of the state of Allodium. And that's what creates the nation of Allodium as a unique people. So all of the people who have aligned with this ideology of their own voluntary choice, that's what creates the people, the nation. So the state was created in the act that I just described. The territory, the country, came in the way that I just described. The nation is all related to the affirmation. So all tied together, there's a state, a nation, and a country. Further, we have our own system, our own judicial system, and we have our own jurisprudence. There's a body of case law that has already been established in the jurisdiction of Allodium. There have been 2 cases that have already been adjudicated by the sovereigns of Allodium, forming their own court and judicial jury of our peers. Further, I cannot be held in a jurisdiction. For there to be a jury of one's peers, sovereigns of Allodium can only be held in the jurisdiction of Allodium because we need a jury of our peers. We need sovereigns, responsible sovereigns, as jurors. We cannot have subjects or brain-dead zombie citizens of some country, nation, state, contracted thing they don't understand in the slightest. Okay, so where do we go from here? So we've established the lawful foundation is in the original constitution of the country of Vermont, that it's the community's right to alter or reform government, that it's an individual or any people's right to establish a state. Once you have it posted and announced and it stands out in the open, there's what conflict exists. So in the current situation with Allodium, there are 2 parties in conflict currently. There's the town of Starksboro, their zoning person, and then there's the Vermont Land Trust, which is a trust which is related to conserving the land of Vermont. It's an interesting question to consider whether the Vermont Land Trust is more interested in conserving the land relative to the state of Vermont or the land in and of itself as the country of Vermont. Because in this case, this piece of land which I have settled, it's my responsibility to cultivate this piece of land to the best of my ability. And so I improve the soil quality. I practice permaculture. I'm building property that increases the value, that can sustain life through a greater duration of seasons than would be otherwise present. So I'm adding to the biodiversity of the ecosystem. I'm adding to the value of the ecosystem. I'm adding to the aesthetic quality of the ecosystem. I'm adding to the productivity of goods and resources from this ecosystem, which can then be traded in relation to the external community that's in the state of Vermont. So in every way, it's a net benefit. It's a symbiotic effect as a result of allodium being in existence as an enclave in the state of Vermont, down to 5% power. So I'm not going to be too long-winded. I'm just trying to cover all the really important things so that what a sheriff, what a judge. I give up on the lawyers. The lawyers don't give a shit about what is right. They don't have inherently virtue. What they're doing is seeking a wage, and in order, so they actually seek out conflict in a way so that they can be employed. So they're employees of conflict in a way. And at one time in a past video, I said something kind of negative about like lawyers insofar as they're upholding the system of the bar, which is established by the Crown in London, the London Bar Association, which all other bars are basically related to that London Bar Association, and it's about keeping everybody subjugated to that top-down system of authority. So in that way, that whole profession is generally antithetical to the well-being of the people. But there are certainly exceptions to that. There are lawyers who are virtuous and put what is right ahead of their paycheck. And I recently saw Robert Kennedy at the Ethan Allen Institute at the General Stark Lectures. I couldn't avoid it, being that he is a truth speaker, that it's the Ethan Allen Institute, which obviously Ethan Allen is kind of like the founding father of the Green Mountain Boys and Vermont in a way. And then General Stark is the basically singularly responsible for defending Vermont as from Crown oppression, and also forming a de facto alliance between the Continental Army of the former colonial states and Vermont, though that alliance had actually already formed as a result of Ticonderoga, and by giving the artillery from Ticonderoga to the Continental Army, that kind of established the alliance between the militia of the country of Vermont and the Continental Army of the former colonial states. So ultimately, anyone who has sworn an oath, oh boy, we're going to have to get into the U.S. Constitution and then the 9th and 10th Amendments, which I'm not super clear about, but anything that's not explicitly in the U.S. Constitution is reserved to the states. So in Vermont, the right of all people to create their own state is retained by all people. The rights which are not enumerated in the Constitution still exist, that the people inherently have them regardless of them being enumerated. So here, Elodia, I'm going to kind of wrap this up. I probably missed things, but that's going to be the end of this rainy day blog. Thank you for listening if you've held on for this long, especially if you are a sheriff, judge, or lawyer and you are interested in conflict resolution as opposed to just interested in overlording the system of jurisdiction which you have accepted for your reality, but to try to impose that upon someone who does not accept that is very similar to slavery or rape even, or there's really nothing good from it. Rape in the sense of preventing the purity of being, flowering of their own nature to come in from an external state and impose your own mentality through force upon an otherwise integral being. It's a form of rape. That's why I would say that word, but it may not be a lawyer that finds common ground. I think the sheriffs certainly can form common ground, but ultimately, if it is required as far as the case goes to the judicial system, then it becomes in the purview of a judge. So it's upon that judge to understand the position in which allodium is and I am, how it's rooted in natural law and the original law of Vermont, the constituted law of the country of Vermont, and how it's still affirmed by the existing Constitution of Vermont in Article 7, even though they struck Article 17, which became 21 when Vermont joined the Union. So the Union of States didn't want any state to join the Union, which enumerated explicitly the right of all people to form their own states out of any territory that they can, or property that they can acquire, country, specifically country, that they can acquire, because the Union of States didn't like the Vermont, the example of Vermont. New York hated Vermont. They did not want Vermont to become a state. And one of the reasons that they ended up accepting Vermont as a state, well, there was the military reason as a result of how Vermont was pivotal in assisting in the Revolutionary War. And there was some assistance in mediating from other delegates, but essentially the former crown colonials, subjects, they didn't like this idea really that people can just form their own country, that they can constitute themselves and form their own country, even though they're like dabbling in that idea in order to form a new government, in order to justify their new claim of their ability to fleece the populace, the local bureaucrat aristocracy that was benefiting under the crown colonial system. They wanted to continue accruing all of those benefits under a new system where they were at the top. They didn't really want a revolutionary change. They wanted to maintain the system that existed, just stop paying the taxes to the British crown. So the whole idea of a country that constitutes itself and by no right from the crown, it wasn't chartered by the crown, by what right did these people do that? They didn't like that in the original 13 colonies, and yet that's what Vermont represents. That's why Vermont exists. That's why it's not just a bigger New Hampshire or a bigger New York. That's what Vermont represents in its existence, and it's integrally more true than America at all. Italy was not a colonizer of America. There was just a guy named Amerigo Vespucci who saw some islands or some land and said, that is named after me. It must be Amerigo. I found it, therefore it's my land, even though there's already people there. That's why we call America America. It's the dumbest name ever. It should actually be Vermont. The entire continent is Vermont. And what does Vermont mean? It means green mountains. You could say the New World is what they called it for a long time. But the reality is that there was already people in the New World. So might as well just call it the Green Mountains, in contrast with the Blue Sea, which they had to cross to get to the Green Mountains. And sure, some of it is, there's Great Plains and there's other areas. And so you could say that the Green Mountains are only specifically the geographical areas which are mountainous and with foliage. That's kind of getting into the semantics of it. But at least just understanding the lawful nature. I'm not just making this up. It's rooted in the same authority by which the state of Vermont was created and the country of Vermont was created. Actually, the country, not the state, because the state was a derivative of the country. This is going on. I'm kind of trying to wrap up, but like at times there's things that I'm missing that are coming up. But that's all for now. Thank you for listening. End of this rainy day vlog.